So let's talk about the history and the origins of CloudFormation. Hopefully you've been through our EC2 fundamental series, and if so, well, in August 2006, when Amazon launched EC2, things started changing. Well, the big move to the cloud age, it wasn't the only thing EC2's inception began. Because you have to understand, at the time, most enterprises, they still wanted to keep things on premises. The idea of putting business critical information on someone else's machine, because by the way, that's all you're really doing when you think about it, well, it seemed absurd to a lot of people. EC2 was still untested, Amazon wasn't nearly as gargantuan as it is now, and poor Werner Vogel was still having to convince companies in person to give it a shot. I mean, it wasn't even called AWS at this point. It was just Amazon.com's retail web services. Well, that all being said, we were on the verge of leaving the Iron Age, the age where everyone was running their own bare metal. And the catalyst for all of this was, of course, it was virtual machines. But using virtual machines in the cloud as your server, it didn't just push virtual machines, also referred to as VMs. It didn't just push those forward. It also pushed forward automation configuration tools like Chef and Puppet. Now, if you're not aware, these tools allow you to automate the setup of your servers. So let's say you have 5 servers that you want load balanced. To deal with massive amounts of traffic, you need to have 5 identical servers that you just split this traffic between so you can keep the user experience good. Well, how do you make sure all 5 of them have the exact software, the exact same software each and every time? Not just on first deploy, but when you send up updates, right? When you do patches. Well, before all of these wonderful automation tools came out, you'd have a lot of home-baked scripts, and you'd also have a lot of manual setup. So a lot of time sunk into doing something that, when you think about it, should be pretty repeatable and therefore, subject to automation. Well, Chef and Puppet, they come in and they say, nope, let's automate this, and let's allow people to do it with code. And so using one of these tools, you could automate the setup of your servers with nothing but code. And so you see where I'm going here? And so this was one of the first modern adoptions of infrastructure as code in general. Chef and Puppet started showing up in businesses left and right, both startups and enterprises. Now, why was this possible? Why hadn't this happened yet? Well, because virtual machines were just taking off, seriously. VMware was getting really hot alongside the whole concept in general. And if configuring your servers is now just configuring virtual machines, well, suddenly scripting them makes a lot more sense. When it's just bare metal and you have to set up each server individually, with no virtual machines, you can't really do that. I mean, I guess you could make a sarcastic to-do list and give it to the network engineer and laugh, but I mean, that's about as far as you're gonna get. And so time continues on with this trend. More and more companies start adopting this idea of running their business on virtualized machines. So servers in a cloud where it's just a VM. And on AWS EC2, since it's the one driving this forward. Virtual machines, they go from being a bleeding edge tool to an absolute requirement. And Chef and Puppet and friends start becoming the backbone of managing these infrastructures. Well, also, upsetting real chefs and puppeteers everywhere every time they go to Google to try and search something about their craft. So we get to 2010. And all this time, the trend just keeps going. More to the cloud, less on the premise. We stop saying if we're going to use the cloud, and we start asking when we're going to do it and get it done. In fact, so much so that during this time in 2010, this is when Microsoft decides, oh crap, we're behind, and in February 2010, Azure officially launches. And so this poodle here, I know that this is an AWS course, but I got to tell you this because it's entertaining. So originally, Azure was known as Red Dog, Project Red Dog. And good old Red Dog was originally meant to be a platform as a service for Windows servers. It's a good thing they didn't stick with that strategy. But the origin of that name was actually pretty weird. It was inspired by this seedy strip joint in San Jose called the Pink Poodle. So Way to keep it classy, Microsoft. But, I guess at least they didn't leave it at that. Anyhow, 2010. With Azure coming out and Microsoft acknowledging the space, the cloud age really arrives, because now you don't just have one major vendor pushing this. You have Microsoft who, in 2008, 2010, that whole space, they are still quite dominant. They're still pretty big. And just when they thought they'd get a leg up, right after they launched Azure, AWS launches a whole army of things. So this is what 2010 looked like for AWS. So first up, this is when they launched their simple notification service. So their service for push messages. Then they launched a whole new region in Singapore called AP Southeast 1. Next is the big one. They go from being Amazon.com, just Amazon.com's retail web services, and they rebrand that section to AWS. And that is when AWS officially comes into play. They launched their Route 53 domain name system, and then last but not least, they launched CloudFormation. I'm pretty sure that Azure, they must have been rolling in terror at all of these launches, because almost all of them came out after Azure launched. They still are competing quite a bit with AWS to the best of their ability. Now, why did this become a thing? And by this, I mean CloudFormation. Why, in the face of new competitors, why in the face of all these new demands and market validation, rebranding to AWS, why shift focus to such a seemingly non-critical product? Because you don't need infrastructure as code to write infrastructure. Well, their launch post actually summed up their motivations pretty well. First, AWS was already programmable, so they knew it was possible to build things in it using repeatable processes. And in this case, that repeatable process was going to be code. Second, and very simply, they just listened to their customers' needs. One of those needs is to precisely replicate an infrastructure that you've built. Why? Well, think of it. If you need a development environment, a staging one, maybe one for beta users, or if you just need to make your infrastructure available in a different region entirely, like maybe AP Southeast 1. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, without CloudFormation, you're going to be redoing it all again and hoping human error doesn't pay you a visit. And it always pays a visit. The analogy that Jeff Barr used in the post was perfect. So what customers were doing up until this point was like cooking. Every time you go to make something, it's going to be a bit different. And that's just the nature of cooking. It's more free-form and less bounded. But when you bake, well, you want things precise so that every time things come out the exact same, or as close as possible. And yes, I didn't even know what that was until that post came out, because I know nothing about cooking or baking. And so, with CloudFormation, developers could step away from being cooks and become bakers. And so, here we are in the future. Since then, just think about how much of a buzzword infrastructure as code has become, which is pretty funny because it's 3 words, but it's still become one nonetheless. Think of all the tools and crazy add-ons people have created. Think of all the crazy forum wars and arguments developers have had. It's gone from being this nice little feature to a must-have if you want to compete in the DevOps endgame. But there is one saving grace of CloudFormation that people underestimate a lot, because there's a lot of great things about it, but there is one that just makes it essential. And it's the sole reason why I suggest learning it over all of the other tooling out there. I don't care how cool whatever framework or library you've selected, how it claims to work with CloudFormation. There is a big reason as to why you want to learn this no matter what. And it's because it's incredibly stable. What you're looking at here is the template format version. This tells CloudFormation how to parse the template. And so if this changes, the rules around how you write templates will inevitably change as well. But guess what? This hasn't changed. It's remained the same. Meaning templates you wrote almost 10 years ago, well, they'd be valid today. The implications of this are that you learn CloudFormation and you don't have to relearn it. You don't have to come back 6 months worried about the developers having an identity crisis and deciding to overhaul the whole thing. And so it becomes one of the few gems you get to learn and not have to relearn.